Hey there, friends and fictional folk! If you had told me 5 years ago that a sequel to a mediocre spin-off of the Shrek franchise was going to be the best movie of 2022, I would not have believed you.
I am known by many names.
In fact, when I first saw the trailers for Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, I was skeptical. I had seen the previous Puss in Boots movie and found it pretty meh.
I am Puss in Boots.
But when I started reading the reviews online and seeing how many people enjoyed it, my interest was piqued. So I went to go see it with my wife while it was still in theaters, and we both absolutely loved it. The movie is a masterclass in animation, storytelling, and character writing, and if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you go watch it before checking out this video. Because here, we will be diving into spoiler territory to examine how Puss in Boots: The Last Wish teaches you to write villains. More specifically, how the movie works as a perfect example of how to write 3 different types of antagonists. And yes, I know that plenty of other people have discussed the various characters of this movie at length since its release, especially its antagonists. But I want to put my 2 cents into the conversation and show you how, as creators, this movie can teach us how to utilize each kind of antagonistic archetype present in the movie in our own works. Often, movies try to cram in a ton of threats for the protagonist to face off against. But equally as often, those antagonists either just sort of blend into each other, fall flat, or feel underdeveloped as characters. The Last Wish, however, manages to make each of its antagonists feel unique and dangerous in their own way. Now you may have noticed, I've stopped saying villains and started calling the enemies Puss in Boots faces throughout the movie antagonists. This is because, for my own personal reference, and for the purposes of this video and discussion, I have dubbed the 3 types of antagonists present in the film as the villain, the rival, and the foil, which correspond in the movie to Jack Horner, Goldilocks, and Death. Each of these exemplify a different kind of antagonist in the story, and present a different set of narrative obstacles to the protagonists, particularly Puss in Boots himself. Also, as a heads up, to avoid YouTube censorship on this video and to make it easier to say, I'll be referring to Puss in Boots the character as Pib from now on. With all that out of the way, let's get started by looking at a surprise entry into this discussion with the Dark Forest. Yes, people aren't the only things that can stand as antagonists to our heroes. The Dark Forest serves as a perfect example of environment as antagonist, known in most middle school and high school English classes as man versus nature. Antagonists like these are literal forces of nature that force the protagonist to adapt and overcome the world around them. They cannot be defeated in a sword fight or a beam struggle, only survived or escaped. This is exemplified in how the Dark Forest itself changes depending on who is holding the map, and alters its challenges to relate to that specific person. These sorts of antagonists are impersonal and larger than life, indifferent to the success or failure of the protagonists, and work wonderfully if the characters need to face an aspect of themselves or their past that would not necessarily be addressed in dialogue between people. For example, when Perito has the map, the first obstacle is a carnivorous flower field, where the solution isn't to defeat the flowers, as there are just too many of them, but rather to stop and smell the roses, as an important lesson for all the characters chasing after the wishing star. After all, anyone desperate enough to seek out a wish probably needs to take a moment to relax and think through their wish. When Pib has the map, the Dark Forest forces him to meet his previous lives, and, like the Song of the Siren, makes him face the choice of staying with them forever and refusing to grow, or leaving and becoming a more responsible person. And one last great example is when Goldilocks has the map. With her mind affecting the environment, the Dark Forest leads her to an exact replica of the house where she first met the 3 bears, and where they raised her as their adopted daughter. This forces her to confront what she plans to wish for, and to consider that maybe she doesn't need the wish, because she already has the family she so desperately desires. In all these cases, the antagonist is not one that can be punched away, but instead trudged through in hopes of reaching one's goal or becoming a better person on the other side. The advantage of the environment as antagonist is that it is too much a force of nature for most characters to beat in combat, and thus requires tough choices to be made. Will you take your time and enjoy the journey, or will you charge headlong toward the destination? Will you close yourself to the world and live in one of your own imaginings, or face change and grow? Will you keep chasing a perfect, impossible dream, or realize that you've already found everything you could ever want or need? These are the sorts of obstacles and questions you can lay at the feet of your characters when the setting itself is the antagonist. Going down the level of impact on the world and scope of villainy, let's take a look at Big Jack Horner. Getting into the actual characters of the film, we start with the one who stands to have the biggest impact on the world of the movie itself.
Ship him out.
Jack Horner is a megalomaniacal CEO of a morally bankrupt company hell-bent on world domination. Glad to see DreamWorks is still taking shots at Disney when they can. Horner is a classic example of what I call the villain archetype of antagonist. Horner has no personal connection to any of the protagonists, but actively stands as a danger to them and the world as a whole. He stands not as an emotional threat, but a physical one that has too many resources for the protagonists to take down as they are, and a looming threat pursuing them on their journey. He is also completely irredeemable. The film makes several jokes about his backstory, and while one of those is relatable, where Horner stands at the beginning and end of the story is as a heartless killer with no remorse for any of his actions or for those he has hurt. We used to call that cartoonish and unrealistic. Then the last decade happened, and it turns out we live in a world full of those kinds of people. Anyway, the villain as an antagonist is best used, as I said before, as a threat, looming over the protagonists and forcing them into motion by their actions. The villain adds a sense of urgency to the plot, and a fantastic final boss for the climactic action scene of the story as a whole. This makes them great for heist stories, like in my own fairy tale-inspired book Strike the Match, where the villain of that story, Don Thomas Tucker, threatens the happily ever after of the main character Enya with his wealth and power. Jack Horner is a perfect example of all of these aspects of the villain, and his usage throughout the film is pretty much perfect, especially because, like many villains of this kind, he is just so fun to hate. A very beer and popcorn type of antagonist, though not one without stakes and tension. But perhaps you want an antagonist whose story runs parallel to the protagonists, rather than directly against them. For that, we need to take a look at Goldilocks. Where Jack Horner was an utterly irredeemable and unsympathetic villain, Goldilocks is a very different type of antagonist. Jack is a flat character. He remains the same person from the beginning to the end. Goldilocks, however, has her own character arc, and it's one that is almost completely separate from the protagonists, yet still opposes them and their goals through much of the story. This is a perfect example of what many, myself included, would call a rival-type antagonist. Rivals, as their name suggests, compete against a protagonist for the same or a similar goal in a story. In the Last Wish's case, that goal is the wishing star. What makes rivals compelling, though, to the point of becoming deuteragonists in many stories, is that they experience their own character arcs and development through the course of the narrative. In Goldie's case, that arc starts with her wanting to use the wishing star to get what she considers a real family, with a human mom and dad, and ends with her realizing she already has a real family in the form of the three bears. Like any good rival, this parallels one of Pib's flaws that he must overcome. Like Goldie, Pib struggles with his relationships with other people, particularly in forming anything past camaraderie or celebrity status. This is the best way to use a rival-style antagonist, having them and their development highlight an aspect of your protagonist's struggles. Their arcs and development may not be identical, of course, but they can force a character to take a deep look at themselves by seeing how their own struggles play out in another person. And consequently, the rival can be forced into that same contemplation and self-reflection by the protagonist. Ultimately, a protagonist and their rival are characters who grow alongside each other, and challenge each other to grow without necessarily being monumental forces that endanger the world. The last kind of antagonist, however, is the most personal of all: death. Death has long been a character in fiction. In a way, they were the first character, being the final looming threat in even our oldest known piece of storytelling, the Epic of Gilgamesh. But there's a reason that personifications of death pop up again and again throughout history. They're just so damn fun to write. And you can tell everyone was having fun working on Death in The Last Wish. From his design, to his fight scenes, to his voice performance.
You know, I'm not a cat person.
Everything about this version of Death screams that he was the crew's favorite character. And if you spend any time online, you can tell he is appreciated by the fans. I'm not gonna lie, he is my favorite character of the movie too, and you can probably make an hour-long video talking about him alone, but I'll try and keep our discussion today focused on his role as an antagonist. And what sort of antagonist is he? Why, he's one of the most narratively compelling of them all, the personal antagonist. The personal antagonist, sometimes called a foil, serves only one purpose in a story: to directly challenge one protagonist and one protagonist alone. The personal antagonist has no goal except to challenge their chosen protagonist, and everything else is secondary. Death in The Last Wish fits this description to a T. He is solely focused on killing Pib in retribution for how he wasted his previous 8 lives. He doesn't care about anyone or anything else. In fact, one interesting thing I noticed while watching the movie was that Death never interacts with anyone other than Pib throughout the entire film. Heck, no one other than Pib even sees him until the climax during their final face-off. Yet he hounds Pib during every step of his journey, forcing him ever onward. And that is the best way to use a personal antagonist, as a force to drive the character forward in the story and in their development. Pib would never have gone into retirement and met Perito if not for his fear of death. He would have never gone after the Wishing Star, or ventured into the dark forest without death shadowing his every step. There's even a chance he might never have left the cave where he was hanging out with all his past lives if Death hadn't shown up to scare the crap out of him. And of course, he would have never come to appreciate life if Death weren't so directly opposed to him in their values at the start of the film. Which leads us to our second surprise antagonist of this film, Puss in Boots himself. Man versus self, or in this case, cat versus self. It is a conflict at the core of almost every story. It essentially defines character development. A character begins the story with a flaw or a personal hurdle to overcome, and must conquer it over the course of the tale. Pib starts the story overconfident, full of himself, full of pride and hubris, and uncaring about much of anything save for his own legend. He treats life like a game, and wastes his first 8 lives frivolously and selfishly, dying each time to one of his vices. Throughout the movie, with some rather strong prompting from his friends and foes, he manages to grow beyond those flaws and truly appreciate life without taking it for granted. And it is only by overcoming himself that he can overcome the other antagonists of the story. Now, does the fact that The Last Wish is a great movie that uses all of these antagonists well mean that every story needs to use all of these antagonists to be a great story? Of course not! Many great stories only have 1 or 2 central antagonists, and some of those great stories have more than one of a certain archetype. Take Lord of the Rings, for example. There are no rival antagonists who go on their own character arcs unless you maybe count Faramir or Boromir, but those are more like allies with a few hiccups. There are, however, multiple villain antagonists, primarily in the form of Sauron and Saruman. At least one instance of the environment as antagonist in the form of the final push through Mordor, and several foils for Frodo in the forms of Smeagol/Gollum and anyone else who gives into their lust for the One Ring. And that's all just scratching the surface. But each of the antagonistic archetypes present in The Last Wish serve as great examples you might consider when crafting your own story, and I hope my breakdown of them will help you in that endeavor. As always, don't overthink exactly what kind of archetype your antagonists fit into, but do consider what sort of antagonists might help your protagonist grow throughout their journey, and how you might implement the lessons of this video and The Last Wish into your own storytelling. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and share it if you feel so inclined. If you'd like to add to the discussion or think I missed something, go ahead and leave a comment down below. And if you want to see more content like this, why not subscribe if you haven't already? Check out my books to support me as an author, and donate to my Patreon so that you can see my videos like these early. Even $1 a month from each of my current subscribers would help me and my editors immensely, since I'd be able to pay them for more than one video every few months. Links, as always, are in the description. Until next time, this is your favorite fearless hero signing off.